There are some wars that feel so long ago, so distant, that you almost can't believe they happened. You read about them in a textbook or see a blurry etching of a battle, and they feel more like a myth than a reality. But then you consider that every single battle, every single decision, every single moment of a war, like the Hundred Years' War, was made by real people with real feelings and real stakes. And suddenly, it all feels very, very close. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is, so you can join the quiet company of people from all over who are settling in for a long, meandering story. This one is less of a bedtime story and more like a long, complicated family feud with swords and really, really bad sanitation. We're going to begin this tale not with a boom, but with a barely audible whisper, a whisper that started in the halls of European royalty long before a single arrow was ever loosed in anger. Imagine a vast, interconnected family tree, a tangled mess of marriages and claims that would make a soap opera writer blush. The Hundred Years' War, you see, was never meant to be a single, monolithic conflict. It was a series of skirmishes, sieges, and battles strung together over a century and a bit more, all born from a simple yet profound question: who gets to sit on the throne? The year is 1328, and France is facing a succession crisis. King Charles IV has died without a male heir, and that's a big problem. French law, specifically something called the Salic Law, which we'll talk more about later, stated that the crown couldn't pass through a female line. The French nobility, looking around for a suitable male to wear the crown, settled on Philip of Valois, a cousin of the late king. He became Philip VI. Seems straightforward enough, right? Except a spanner was about to be thrown in the works from across the English Channel. In England, a young, ambitious king named Edward III had a rather compelling claim of his own. His mother, remember that family tree I mentioned? His mother was Isabella, the sister of the late King Charles IV of France. According to Edward, this made him the legitimate heir, or at the very least, a much more legitimate heir than some cousin. Think of it like this: your parents and their siblings all have a claim to the family business, but then they all pass away. The business is now up for grabs. Do you, the grandchild of the original founder, have a better claim than a distant cousin who was never really in the loop? That was the core of the problem. A simple family dispute that would go on to reshape the very map of Europe. It was also, as you can imagine, a brilliant pretext for something that was already brewing between the two nations. Now, while the French and English crowns were bickering over who had the better family credentials, there was another, more tangible dispute simmering just below the surface: money, specifically the wool trade. The English economy was, for all intents and purposes, built on the backs of sheep. They produced some of the finest wool in Europe, and a massive chunk of it was sold to the cloth-making towns of Flanders, a region that was technically under the suzerainty of the French king. So, the English had the wool, the Flemish had the looms, and the French had the political leverage. It was an economic power triangle just waiting to topple over. when Philip VI of France began to meddle in the affairs of Flanders and even threatened to cut off the supply of English wool. Edward III of England had an immediate and very personal reason to fight back. It wasn't just about a crown. It was about the very lifeblood of his kingdom's economy. Historians still argue whether the succession claim was the real spark, or if it was just a convenient excuse for an economic war that was going to happen anyway. Was Edward a true believer in his right to the French throne, or was he a pragmatist using a shaky genealogical argument to protect his nation's trade interests? Honestly, it was probably a little bit of both. Ambition and greed are rarely mutually exclusive. The political and economic tensions were so taut, you could practically hear them humming. The French king had a vested interest in keeping the English out of Flanders, and the English king had an even greater interest in keeping his wool trade flowing freely. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the first act of this epic, drawn-out drama was about to begin. All it needed was a little push, a royal decree here, a whispered insult there. And soon enough, the knives were out, and the archers were getting ready. So, while everyone was busy arguing over whose great-great-uncle was who, the real forces of history were at work. The scent of a good fight was in the air. The French were confident, the English were ambitious, and the stage was set for a conflict that would drag on not for a decade, or even two, but for generations. A war that would see fathers and sons, and grandsons and great-grandsons all fighting the same fight, for the same reasons, or at least the same pretexts. It was a war that would outlive the people who started it and change the course of two nations forever. And it all began with a dead king and a succession crisis that no one could quite agree on. As the gears of war slowly began to turn, Edward III, the ambitious young King of England, knew that a good claim to the throne was only half the battle. The other half was convincing people to fight for it. He couldn't just walk into Paris and demand the crown. That would be like showing up at your cousin's wedding and declaring you're the one who should be getting married. The English king had to build a coalition, or at least a network of allies, and he had to do it with a delicate touch and a lot of money. Remember how I mentioned the Flemings and their wool? That was Edward's first and most important bargaining chip. He needed their economic power and, crucially, their strategic location right on France's northern border. So, Edward spent a good deal of time and treasure wooing the Flemish towns, essentially telling them, hey, your liege Lord Philip VI is a bit of a bully, and I'm your friend. Want some trade deals and maybe some military protection? It was a classic case of playing sides against the middle, and it worked brilliantly. The Flemings, perpetually annoyed by French interference in their affairs, were more than willing to listen. While he was busy building alliances on the continent, Edward also had to make a public and very dramatic declaration of his intentions. In 1340, he took the plunge. He formally assumed the title of King of France. Now, this wasn't just a fancy bit of political theater. This was a direct, in-your-face challenge to Philip VI. By claiming the title, Edward was essentially saying, I am the rightful king. Philip is an impostor. He even went so far as to quarter the French royal coat of arms, the three golden lilies, or fleur-de-lis, with the English leopards on his own shield. It was a visual statement that left no room for ambiguity. This move was not just for show either. It was a strategic masterstroke. It solidified his claim in the eyes of his allies, gave his subjects a powerful rallying cry, and painted the French king as a usurper. A historian once wrote, in a very polite way, that this was the 14th century equivalent of changing your social media profile picture to a banner that says, "I'm the CEO now." It was a bold move that made reconciliation nearly impossible. But Edward was never really looking for reconciliation. He was looking for a fight. But before the armies could clash on land, the sea was going to have its say. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water separating England and France, was a vital highway. Whoever controlled it had a massive advantage. They could move troops and supplies, launch raids, and disrupt their enemy's trade. Philip VI of France, understanding this, had been building a large fleet, a mix of French ships and vessels hired from Genoa, an Italian city-state known for its formidable maritime power. This fleet was a serious threat, a dagger pointed right at the heart of England. It was stationed in the Zwin estuary, near the port of Sluys, in modern-day Belgium, essentially blockading any English movement. Edward III knew he had to break this blockade if his continental plans were to succeed. So, in the summer of 1340, he gathered his own fleet, packed with thousands of soldiers and archers, and set sail for a showdown. The naval battle of Sluys wasn't a battle of grand, sweeping maneuvers. It was a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. The French ships were packed tightly in the estuary, chained together in a defensive formation. This made them a solid wall, but also an immobile, vulnerable target. Edward III, arriving with his fleet, saw his chance. He deployed his ships in a clever formation, using archers to rain down arrows on the French decks from a distance. The English longbow, a weapon we'll talk about much more, was the star of the show. Imagine being on a ship, a tiny floating island of wood, with thousands of arrows whistling down on you like a deadly hailstorm. It was a terrifying experience. Once the English ships got close enough, the fighting devolved into a bloody melee, with soldiers leaping from ship to ship, clashing with swords and axes. The French formation, so strong on paper, was a death trap in practice. The English longbowmen decimated the French and Genoese sailors, and the English knights and men-at-arms, a little like an angry swarm of bees, overwhelmed the remaining defenders. The result was a stunning, lopsided victory for England. The French fleet was virtually annihilated. Accounts from the time suggest that the French lost thousands of men, while English casualties were comparatively light. The English didn't just win the battle, they wiped the French naval presence from the map for years to come. It was so decisive that, according to a contemporary chronicler, no one in the French court dared to tell Philip VI the news directly. So his jester did it by announcing, "Oh, those cowardly English." The sailors on their ships jumped into the water and became fish. Philip was reportedly not amused. This victory had massive strategic implications. It secured English control of the Channel for decades, allowing them to move troops and supplies to France with relative ease. It gave Edward III a massive boost in prestige and legitimacy, and it was a terrible early psychological blow to the French crown. The war was officially on, and the English had just landed the first haymaker, with the English Channel now a friendly highway instead of a watery wall. Edward III was free to bring the fight directly to France's doorstep. But he learned a quick lesson. Naval dominance doesn't win a land war on its own. The early years of campaigning were a lot like a heavyweight boxer dancing around the ring, looking for an opening but never quite landing a knockout punch. There were a lot of raids, a lot of sieges, but no decisive, kingdom-shaking victory. Then, in 1346, Edward decided to go big. He landed an army in Normandy, a region in northwestern France, and began what was essentially a massive, destructive raid, a campaign known as a chevauchée. The goal wasn't to hold territory, but to cause so much chaos and economic damage that the French crown would be forced into a decisive battle on English terms. This was a brutal but highly effective strategy, and it worked. Edward's army moved across the French countryside, burning towns and pillaging villages, drawing a wide arc of destruction that pulled the French King Philip the Kid into a pursuit. Philip VI, now thoroughly provoked and with his honor on the line, gathered a massive army and began to chase the English forces. The English, weary and outnumbered, were eventually cornered near a small, inconsequential town called Crécy. Edward III chose his ground carefully, a gently sloping hill with woods on either side, which would protect his flanks. He dismounted his knights and had them fight on foot, a tactical innovation that would become a hallmark of English warfare. But the real star of the show, the character who deserves their own dramatic entrance music, was the English longbow. It was a 6-foot-tall piece of yew wood, capable of launching a yard-long arrow with incredible force and accuracy. A skilled longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute, creating a relentless, deadly downpour. The English army had thousands of these archers, as the French army, a sprawling mass of knights and infantry, advanced on the English position. The battle began with a volley from Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries hired by the French. However, their crossbows had a much slower rate of fire, and their strings were wet from a sudden rain shower, making them far less effective than they should have been. Then, the English longbows started singing. The sound must have been terrifying, a buzzing cloud of arrows darkening the sky. The first charge of French knights, a glorious and chivalrous-looking spectacle, was met with a storm of lethal projectiles that took down horses and men alike. The knights, weighed down by heavy armor and struggling to get up in the mud after their mounts were hit, were easy targets for the English infantry, who moved in to finish them off. The French, in a moment of utter tactical confusion, kept sending waves of knights into the same deadly trap, each new charge suffering the same fate as the last. It was, to be perfectly blunt, a disaster for the French. The Battle of Crécy was a lopsided, brutal slaughter. The English forces, with their disciplined archers and solid defensive position, completely annihilated the much larger French army. The French lost thousands upon thousands of men, including many of the most senior nobles, and even Philip VI's brother, all for very little English loss. It was a shocking victory, one that completely upended the medieval understanding of warfare. For centuries, the knight on horseback had been the ultimate battlefield weapon, the symbol of chivalry and power. Crécy proved that a disciplined force of commoners with a new weapon could utterly decimate an army of nobles. It was a little like showing up to a high-tech drone war with a trebuchet. It just didn't work anymore. The victory at Crécy had massive consequences. It didn't win the war, not by a long shot, but it gave the English a massive morale boost, and perhaps more importantly, an immense amount of prestige. Edward III, now seen as a brilliant military commander, was able to solidify his position and his claims. For the French, it was a humiliating and devastating loss. It exposed the weaknesses in their military structure and their command, and it showed the entire world that the old ways of war were no longer the best ways. It was a mainstream historical fact, now proven in the most gruesome possible way, that the age of the heavily armored knights' battlefield dominance was coming to a very messy and very bloody end. With their pride and their army shattered, the French were now in a precarious position, and Edward III knew exactly what to do next. He had just won a spectacular battle, but to win the war, he needed something more permanent, a foothold in France. The stunning victory at Crécy wasn't just a morale booster, it was a psychological weapon. It gave Edward III the confidence to pursue a new, more strategic objective. He knew that to truly threaten the French crown and secure his territorial ambitions, he needed a permanent foothold, a place he could use to land troops, launch campaigns, and disrupt French trade. He set his sights on the port city of Calais, situated right on the Strait of Dover. It was a crucial strategic point, a gateway between England and the continent. Capturing it would be a major blow to French prestige and a massive boon for English power. But taking a fortified city in the 14th century wasn't as easy as just showing up and asking politely. It meant a long, drawn-out affair known as a siege. So, after his army had recovered from the triumph at Crécy, Edward marched them straight to Calais and began to lay siege to the city in the fall of 1346. Sieges were a very different kind of war. They weren't about grand battles and heroic charges. They were about patience, endurance, and slowly strangling a city into submission. Edward built a fortified camp, essentially a temporary town for his army, outside the walls of Calais. He cut off all supply lines, making sure no food or reinforcements could get in. He had siege engines, massive catapults, and trebuchets that would hurl rocks and other less pleasant things over the walls. But the real weapon was starvation. He was betting that the people inside would eventually give up rather than die of hunger. Life inside the city walls became a waking nightmare. As the months dragged on, food supplies dwindled and desperation grew. The French king, Philip VI, tried to relieve the city, but he was unable to get his army past the well-fortified English positions and the marshy land surrounding Calais. He knew that to attack was to risk another Crécy-style disaster, and he wasn't about to repeat that mistake. So, the people of Calais were left to their fate. As the winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, the situation became unbearable. The citizens of Calais, led by their captain, were finally forced to a decision. They had to surrender. But here's where the story takes a turn. A moment so famous it's become a part of the historical canon. Edward III, reportedly furious at the long resistance of the city, was ready to make an example of them. He demanded that 6 of the city's leading citizens, the burghers, come to him with ropes around their necks and the keys to the city and castle in their hands. They were to be executed as an example to all who might resist the English king. This was a harsh demand, a cold-blooded act of psychological warfare, but it was also a test of courage. 6 men volunteered to sacrifice themselves for their city, led by a wealthy merchant named Eustache de Saint-Pierre. They walked out of the city, dressed in rags, with ropes around their necks, and laid the keys at Edward's feet. It was a dramatic, heart-wrenching scene. However, the story doesn't end with their deaths. Edward's wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, who was pregnant at the time and a famously compassionate woman, begged her husband to spare the men's lives. She argued that their deaths would be a stain on his reputation and an act of unnecessary cruelty. After much pleading, and perhaps a bit of quiet pressure from his own commanders, Edward relented. The 6 burghers were spared. It was a rare moment of mercy in an otherwise brutal war. A little ray of sunlight in a very dark saga. This story is so iconic that it has been depicted in art for centuries. A famous sculpture by Auguste Rodin is a beautiful and haunting representation of the moment. The capture of Calais was a monumental achievement for the English. It gave them a secure, permanent port on the French coast, a dagger pointing at the heart of France, as it was often called. It would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, a constant symbol of their power and their ambition. For the French, it was a terrible loss, a humiliation that they would not soon forget. The war had now entered a new phase. It wasn't just about battles anymore. It was about controlling territory, holding strategic points, and establishing a presence that would be very difficult to dislodge. The English had a foothold, a place to call their own, and the French knew that they were in for a very, very long fight. Little did either side know that the next battle would not be fought with swords and arrows, but with an enemy that cared nothing for crowns or claims. With Edward III now firmly in control of Calais, the English had a permanent toehold on the continent, a logistical hub from which to launch future campaigns. Things were looking up for the English and decidedly grim for the French. But history, as it often does, had a wild card up its sleeve. A new enemy, far more devastating than any army, was about to arrive on Europe's shores. This was an enemy that didn't care about claims to the throne, family feuds, or the price of wool. This was the Black Death. The bubonic plague, a terrifying, fast-acting disease, had been spreading across Asia and the Middle East for years, and by the late 1340s, it made its unwelcome way to Europe. It arrived, carried by fleas on rats, that hitched a ride on merchant ships in 1347. From there, it spread with frightening speed. The plague was a biological weapon of mass destruction that utterly dwarfed anything the English and French could throw at each other. Imagine a world with no understanding of germs, no modern medicine, and no concept of sanitation. People lived in close, often squalid conditions, making the plague spread almost unstoppable. The symptoms were horrific: high fevers, painful swellings of the lymph nodes called buboes, and dark blotches on the skin, which gave the disease its memorable, if grim, name. A person could go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. The sheer randomness of it was part of its terror. It didn't discriminate between rich or poor, noble or commoner. It was a great equalizer, and a terrible one. The impact on both England and France was catastrophic. Entire towns and villages were decimated. Agricultural output plummeted as farmers died in the fields. The economy ground to a halt. In some places, a third to half of the population was wiped out in a few short years. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend that kind of devastation today. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, but whether it was 30% or 60% of the population, the result was the same: a society in ruins. The Hundred Years' War, which had been the singular focus of both kingdoms, suddenly felt trivial in the face of such a profound crisis. The fighting had to stop. Armies were melting away as soldiers either died of the plague or deserted to go home and be with their families. It's hard to fight a war when you're worried about catching a disease that kills you in a day. For a time, the war entered an enforced, unsettling truce. The two kings, Edward III and Philip VI, had to focus on managing a public health catastrophe instead of a military conflict. This period wasn't about heroic battles. It was about the quiet, desperate struggle for survival. But even in this devastation, there were long-term consequences that would affect the war when it eventually resumed. The massive loss of life created labor shortages, which in turn gave peasants and commoners more leverage. With fewer people to work the land, they could demand higher wages and better conditions. This began a slow but irreversible shift in the social structure of feudal Europe. The old system, where everyone had a set place in society, was beginning to crack under the weight of so much death. This period also served as a kind of grim reset button. It changed the strategic landscape of the war. When the fighting eventually picked back up, it would be a new generation of soldiers, a new set of commanders, and a world that had been fundamentally altered. The collective trauma of the Black Death would linger for decades, a shadowy presence that influenced everything from art and literature to political decisions. For a moment, the conflict that would come to define the 14th century was completely eclipsed by an event that defined the human condition itself. And while the plague did eventually recede, it didn't disappear completely. It would return in smaller, but still deadly, waves for centuries to come, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. But as the world slowly began to recover from this cataclysmic event, the ancient grudges and claims to power began to resurface. The Hundred Years' War was on an interlude, not a final curtain call. As Europe slowly began to pull itself back from the brink of oblivion after the devastation of the Black Death, The old rivalries and ambitions that had been put on hold started to simmer once again. The war was like a hibernating bear, and it was about to wake up, cranky and hungry. In France, Philip VI had died in 1350, and the crown had passed to his son, John II, known as John the Good. In England, Edward III was still very much in charge and just as ambitious as ever. He and his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, a fearsome warrior who earned the nickname the Black Prince, were itching to resume the fight. The Black Prince was a warrior straight out of a storybook, a figure of incredible courage and tactical genius. He was also, by all accounts, as brutal as he was effective. The English strategy remained the same: launch devastating raids or chevaucher deep into French territory to cause economic ruin and provoke the French king into a pitched battle. In 1356, the Black Prince led one such raid through the heart of France, a campaign of burning and pillaging that was so destructive it drew the French army out to meet him. King John II, with a much larger force, managed to corner the English army near the city of Poitiers. The English were in a precarious position. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and their line of retreat was cut off. It looked like a replay of Crécy, but with the roles reversed. This time, the French had the numbers and the strategic advantage. The Black Prince, however, was a master of defensive warfare. He chose his ground carefully, positioning his army on a slope surrounded by hedges and vineyards, which made it difficult for the French cavalry to charge effectively. He also dismounted his knights and men-at-arms, creating a solid wall of disciplined fighters, much like his father had done at Crécy. And of course, he had his secret weapon, the longbowmen. They were placed on the flanks, where they could rain down arrows on the charging French with devastating effect. The battle began with a French cavalry charge, which quickly devolved into chaos as the horses struggled through the uneven terrain and were brought down by the relentless volleys of arrows. The French, just like at Crécy, refused to learn the lesson. They continued to send wave after wave of soldiers into the English defenses, and each time they were met with the same deadly reception. The English longbowmen were so effective that the French commanders had to make a change. They dismounted their own knights and had them charge on foot, hoping to overwhelm the English in a massed assault. But this just turned the battle into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest, where the English, fighting from a prepared defensive position, had the upper hand. The French army, despite its size, became disorganized and disjointed. It's a classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen. The French nobility, each one with their own banner and their own sense of chivalry, were unable to act as a cohesive unit. The English, on the other hand, fought with grim, disciplined efficiency. At a critical moment, a small group of English soldiers on horseback managed to flank the French army, and the sight of what looked like new reinforcements was enough to cause a panic. The French line broke, and a rout ensued. The Battle of Poitiers was an even more stunning victory than Crécy. Not only did the English win against overwhelming odds, but they also captured the most important prize imaginable: King John II of France himself. He was taken prisoner, a massive blow to French morale and a huge bargaining chip for the English. John was brought back to England and treated with all the respect due to a king. But he was still a captive. The capture of a monarch was a massive deal, a shock to the entire European political system. It was a mainstream historical fact, now proven in the most dramatic possible way, that the English were not just a nuisance. They were a legitimate threat to the very existence of the French kingdom. With their king a prisoner and their army in tatters, France was plunged into a period of profound political instability, a crisis that would pave the way for the next, equally dramatic, chapter of this long and bloody war. With King John II of France now a royal guest, or more accurately, a very high-value prisoner in England, France was thrown into a state of profound disarray. The government was in chaos, and a power vacuum opened up. The Dauphin, the future Charles V, was a young, inexperienced man trying to hold the kingdom together in the face of widespread discontent. The loss of the king and the disastrous defeats at Crécy and Poitiers had not only shattered the military, but had also destroyed the French nobility's reputation. People were starting to question the entire feudal system. This was the era of the Jacquerie, a massive peasant uprising in the north of France in 1358. Farmers, pushed to the breaking point by war, taxation, and the constant threat of marauding soldiers, rose up in a bloody, short-lived revolt. They were eventually crushed, but the message was clear. The French ruling class had lost the faith of its people. Edward III, ever the opportunist, saw this as the perfect moment to press his advantage. He launched yet another invasion of France, hoping to take Paris itself and force a final, decisive surrender. But this time, things were different. The French, under the guidance of the Dauphin, had learned their lessons the hard way. They adopted a new strategy. They refused to give battle. Instead of marching their army out to meet the English in a grand, chivalrous confrontation, they pulled their troops back into fortified towns and castles. They let Edward's army march through the countryside, knowing that the English would eventually run out of supplies and be forced to negotiate. It was a clever, frustrating tactic, the 14th century equivalent of an opponent simply refusing to engage in a video game. It worked. Edward's army got bogged down. A large army is a hungry army, and it wasn't getting the big, glorious battle it had wanted. Both sides were, for different reasons, ready to talk. The English had a high-value prisoner and a strong hand, but they were exhausted from campaigning. The French were in a desperate state, with their king in prison, their treasury empty, and their people in open revolt. The negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. On the surface, it looked like a massive English victory. The terms were eye-watering. First, King John II's ransom was set at an astronomical 3 million gold crowns, a sum so large it was almost impossible for the French to pay. Second, and even more significantly, Edward III gave up his claim to the French throne. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine concession or a canny move to consolidate his gains. In return, he was granted full sovereignty over a massive swathe of French territory, including the Duchy of Aquitaine and the city of Calais. This was a crucial point. Edward would hold these lands not as a vassal to the French king, but as an independent ruler. The Treaty of Bretigny was meant to be a permanent peace, a grand finale to the first phase of the war. It was a formal acknowledgement of English power and a stunning triumph for Edward III. But it had a fatal flaw. The clauses were so punitive, so humiliating for the French, that it sowed the seeds for future conflict. The French nobility, and especially the Dauphin, never truly accepted the loss of so much territory and prestige. The treaty was a moment of forced capitulation, not genuine reconciliation. Think of it like a sports team that's forced to sign a contract after a brutal loss. They'll follow the letter of the law, but they'll be plotting their comeback the whole time. The treaty did, however, bring a much-needed period of calm. For the next several years, there was no major campaigning. The fighting stopped, but the war, the underlying conflict of claims and ambitions, was far from over. It was simply in remission. The stage was now set for the next chapter of the war, one that would see a new French king and a new, more effective strategy to fight back against English dominance. The Treaty of Bretigny was a pause, not a period. While it had officially granted Edward III vast territories in France and an enormous ransom for the captured king, the ink on the parchment was barely dry before a new generation of French leaders began to plot their comeback. King John II died in 1364 while still a captive in England, and his son, the former Dauphin, was crowned King Charles V. Charles, known as the Wise, was a very different kind of king than his father. He was not a flashy warrior in the mold of the Black Prince, but a meticulous, calculating statesman. He understood that the old chivalric ways of fighting had failed spectacularly. He knew he couldn't win a battle against the English in open combat, not with their devastating longbows and disciplined infantry. So, he embraced a new strategy. Don't fight them on their terms. To execute this new plan, Charles V needed a brilliant military commander, someone who could win not with heroic charges, but with cunning and attrition. He found that man in Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight who was the antithesis of the typical noble warrior. Du Guesclin was an ugly, gruff man, but he was a genius at a new kind of warfare. He was the master of guerrilla tactics, raids, and most importantly, the systematic reclamation of lost territory through siege and ambush. Charles and Du Guesclin's new strategy was simple but brutally effective. Avoid large-scale battles at all costs. Instead, they would harass the English, cut off their supply lines, and besiege their garrisons one by one. This was a long, slow, and grinding kind of war, but it was the only way to win. It was a new school of thought that believed you win the war by not losing battles. The English, under the command of the Black Prince, were frustrated by this new approach. They were used to fighting glorious, pitched battles where they could win with their superior military tactics. But Du Guesclin refused to give them one. He would engage in small skirmishes and then melt away. He would lay siege to an English-held town. And when an English relief force arrived, he would disappear into the countryside, only to reappear a few weeks later to besiege another town. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts. The English, in their heavily fortified castles and garrisons, were like a man in a boat with 1,000 holes being poked in it. They were slowly but surely sinking. The French were, in effect, playing a game of chess, while the English were still trying to win with a glorified slugfest. This shift in strategy was revolutionary. It completely changed the nature of the Hundred Years' War. The period between 1369 and 1374 is often called the Caroline War, named after King Charles III, and it was a stunning success for the French. Du Guesclin, with his relentless campaigning and refusal to be drawn into a major battle, systematically began to win back the territories the English had gained in the Treaty of Bretigny. The English were a force of occupation in many of these territories, and the local populations, who were not exactly fond of their new English overlords, often sided with Du Guesclin. It became a war of hearts and minds, as well as a war of swords and spears. The French were reclaiming lost territory at a pace that shocked everyone. The English, under a now ailing and increasingly frustrated Black Prince, were losing their grip on their continental possessions. They were simply unable to adapt to this new style of warfare. Their power was in pitched battles, and the French had taken that option off the table by the time of the Black Prince's death in 1376 and Edward III's death in 1377. The English had lost almost all the land they had gained in the Treaty of Bretigny, holding on only to a handful of coastal towns, including Bordeaux. Of course, the ever-important Calais. The war had swung back in France's favor, not with one dramatic victory, but with 1,000 small, grinding ones. It was a lesson in the power of patience and strategic thinking over brute force, and it would set the stage for the next, equally complex, chapter of this long and bloody saga. With the French now regaining their footing, the war seemed to be swinging decisively in their favor. The great English heroes, Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, were gone. Edward III died in 1377, a disappointed and somewhat broken man. He was succeeded by his grandson, Richard II, who was just a boy. The English throne, which had seemed so secure under Edward III's long and glorious reign, was now in the hands of a child and his squabbling council. This internal instability in England was a godsend for the French. The English government, distracted by its own internal politics and a massive peasant uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, was unable to launch any major campaigns in France. They were too busy dealing with their own problems to worry about lost territories on the continent. On the other side of the Channel, the French were also having a rough time. King Charles V, the Wise, died in 1380, and his son, Charles VI, also ascended the throne as a young boy. The French government was similarly plagued by factionalism and infighting among the young king's uncles. It was a strange period in the war, a kind of stalemate brought on not by military might, but by a shared lack of strong adult leadership. The fighting didn't completely stop, but it lost its grand, sweeping scale. It devolved into a series of smaller, more localized skirmishes. Both kingdoms, exhausted by decades of fighting and the economic ruin of the Black Death, were essentially running on fumes. It was during this period of mutual weakness that a series of truces were signed. These weren't permanent peace treaties like the Treaty of Bretigny. They were temporary ceasefires, often for a few months or a few years at a time. The most significant of these was the Truce of Lulling, signed in 1389, which was meant to last for 3 years, but was repeatedly extended. It was a period of détente, a time when both sides were able to catch their breath and deal with their domestic problems. The truce was a pragmatic necessity, born out of a shared exhaustion. It was a clear acknowledgement that neither side had the strength or the resources to deliver a knockout blow. But even during this period of relative peace, the underlying tensions didn't disappear. The young English king, Richard II, was a complex and controversial figure. He was more interested in diplomacy and a negotiated peace with France than in his grandfather's quest for military glory. He married Isabella, the daughter of the French king Charles VI, as part of a peace initiative. He seemed to genuinely want to end the war, but his vision was at odds with the powerful English nobility who had grown rich and powerful fighting in France. These nobles, led by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, were not ready to give up their claims and their chance at glory. This internal division in England would eventually lead to a civil war of its own. In a sense, this period was the quiet before the storm. Both nations were dealing with their own internal strife, giving them a chance to heal and regroup. The war had been going on for over 50 years, and the generation that started it was long gone. The kings who now ruled were born into a world defined by the conflict, and they were, for a time, willing to try a different approach. But the truce, however long it lasted, didn't solve the fundamental problem. The English still had a claim on the French throne and a foothold in France, and the French still saw them as invaders. It was a fragile peace built on a foundation of unresolved conflict. The truce would eventually break, and when it did, a new English king, with a new sense of purpose and a fresh army, would emerge to restart the war with a vengeance. The fragile truce between England and France, born of mutual exhaustion and political weakness, was shattered in the early 15th century by the rise of a new English king. The end of the 14th century saw the deposition and murder of Richard II, a king who had sought a peaceful end to the war. He was replaced by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. This was a messy, complex moment in English history, one that gave birth to decades of internal strife. But Henry IV, for all his ambition, was bogged down by constant rebellions and a shaky claim to the throne. The war with France was a back-burner issue for his entire reign. He spent his time trying to put out fires at home, not ignite new ones abroad. But all of that changed with the ascension of his son, Henry V, in 1413. Henry V was, in many ways, the polar opposite of the diplomatic Richard II. He was a young, charismatic, and devoutly religious man with a laser-like focus on one thing: reclaiming the English claims in France. He was a master of propaganda, portraying himself not as an aggressor, but as the rightful heir to the French throne, a man on a divine mission to restore what was rightfully his. The French, for their part, were in a state of utter chaos. King Charles was suffering from bouts of insanity, often believing he was made of glass. The country was ruled by his squabbling relatives, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who were in the midst of a bloody civil war with each other. It was a perfect storm for an ambitious English king to take advantage of. Henry IV began his reign by sending a list of demands to the French court, which was so outlandish they could only be considered a formal declaration of intent to go to war. He demanded not only the English lands from the Treaty of Bretigny, but also the French crown itself, as well as a massive, unpaid ransom for King John II. The French, with their king in and out of lucidity, and their country tearing itself apart, had little choice but to refuse. Henry V, with his claims now officially rejected, had the pretext he needed. He raised a massive army, funded by taxes and loans, and prepared for a grand campaign that would make his great-grandfathers seem small by comparison. In 1415, Henry V landed his army in Normandy. His initial objective was the port city of Harfleur, a key strategic location. The siege of Harfleur was a difficult, brutal affair. The English army was decimated not by French soldiers, but by dysentery, a common and often fatal disease that spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of a medieval siege camp. The English eventually captured the city, but their army was in terrible shape. Henry V, with his forces weakened and the campaigning season drawing to a close, made a bold, some would say foolhardy, decision. Instead of sailing back to England, he decided to march his army across northern France through enemy territory to the English-held port of Calais. This march was a replay of Edward III's disastrous campaign that had led to Crécy, but with one major difference. The French, now led by the Constable Charles d'Albret, were determined not to make the same mistake twice. They shadowed Henry's army, gathering a massive force of their own, and finally managed to cut off his path to Calais. Henry IV's army, exhausted and sick, was in a desperate situation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define this new phase of the war. Just like at Crécy, the English were outnumbered and cornered. Just like at Poitiers, they had a brilliant commander and a secret weapon. The French, confident in their numbers and their chivalric might, were sure of victory. They had no idea that they were about to walk into one of the most famous and devastating ambushes in military history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the next phase of the war. After a grueling march across northern France, Henry V's army, sickly, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, found its path to Calais, blocked by a massive French force near the village of Agincourt. This was it. There was no way out. The English had to fight, and they had to win. The French army was a grand and glorious sight, a sea of banners and flashing armor, a physical representation of chivalry and power. They were confident, perhaps even arrogant in their numbers and their strength. They had no doubt they would crush the small, beleaguered English force. But Henry V, a master tactician, chose his ground with the same care and cunning as his predecessors. He positioned his army on a narrow field between two thick woods, a perfect, natural bottleneck. This negated the French numerical superiority, forcing them to attack in a tight, concentrated formation where their massive cavalry and infantry could not maneuver effectively. He also, and this is the crucial part, had his archers plant sharp, pointed stakes into the ground in front of their positions, creating a deadly fence that would impale any charging horse. This was a direct, practical counter to the French cavalry, and it was a stroke of genius. The battle began on a cold, muddy morning, October 25th, 1415. The field was a quagmire, turned into a thick, clinging mud pit by recent rain. For the heavily armored French knights, this was a disaster. It was like trying to run in quicksand. For the lightly armored English archers, it was a minor inconvenience. The battle started with the English archers letting loose a terrifying volley of arrows. The sheer number of projectiles flying through the air must have been a truly horrific sight and sound. It was the signal for the French to begin their charge. But what followed was less of a charge and more of a clumsy stumble. The French knights, weighed down by their heavy plate armor and struggling through the mud, were an easy target. Those who made it to the English lines were funneled into the narrow corridor between the woods, where they were met with a wall of English men-at-arms. The battle quickly devolved into a bloody, chaotic melee. The French knights, packed so tightly together, were unable to swing their weapons effectively. They were also being pushed forward by the sheer weight of their own numbers, crushing the men in front of them. It was a mass of humanity, a great, suffocating press of men and armor. The English, in their lighter armor, were far more agile and were able to exploit the chaos. The English archers, their quivers now empty of arrows, dropped their bows and joined the fight with hatchets and daggers, moving through the carnage and finishing off the trapped French knights. The sheer scale of the French disaster was incredible. They lost thousands upon thousands of men, including a huge portion of their nobility. 3 dukes, 7 counts, and 90 barons were killed. A generational blow to the French aristocracy. The English, on the other hand, suffered relatively light casualties. The Battle of Agincourt was not just a victory. It was a military and psychological masterpiece. It was the definitive proof that the English longbow, when used with brilliant defensive tactics, could absolutely dominate the battlefield. It was a devastating humiliation for the French and a massive propaganda victory for Henry V. He was now seen as the greatest military commander of his age, a new Edward III. It solidified his claim to the French throne in the eyes of his own people and gave him the prestige and power he needed to continue his campaign. The victory at Agincourt, like Crécy before it, was a stark lesson in how modern military strategy and a little mud can defeat the old chivalric ways of war. The French had failed to learn the lesson, and they paid a terrible price. Following the stunning and decisive victory at Agincourt, Henry V was in a position of immense strength. The French nobility was shattered, their military prestige was in ruins, and their government was in a state of civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. King Charles VI was still prone to long bouts of madness, leaving a power vacuum that a sane, ruthless, and ambitious king like Henry IV was more than happy to fill. But instead of pushing for a total military conquest, Henry V adopted a more measured political strategy. He knew that to truly claim the French crown, he had to do more than just win battles. He had to win the hearts and minds of at least some of the French people, or at the very least, a powerful faction of them. This opportunity arose in a truly bizarre and tragic way. In 1419, the leader of the Burgundian faction, John the Fearless, was assassinated by agents of the Dauphin, the future Charles VII. This act of cold-blooded murder was the final straw. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was so enraged by the death of his father that he essentially swore allegiance to the English king. This was a monumental shift in the war. The English now had a powerful, wealthy, and politically connected French ally. Henry IV, with the support of the Burgundians, was now a major player in French internal politics, not just a foreign invader. He had gone from a king with a flimsy claim to a king with a powerful French partner. The negotiations that followed were a testament to Henry V's skill as a diplomat and a pragmatist. With the Burgundians at his side and the French court in disarray, he was able to dictate terms that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The result was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. The treaty was, in a word, audacious. It declared that Henry VIII would marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the insane French king Charles VI. More importantly, it disinherited the Dauphin, Charles, and declared that Henry V and his heirs would be the rightful successors to the French throne. This was the ultimate prize, the grand finale to a lifetime of ambition. Henry V would not only be the King of England, but also the future King of France. The two kingdoms would be united under one crown. The Treaty of Troyes was a complete and total surrender of the French monarchy's independence. It was a humiliating moment for the French, a political document that was essentially an acknowledgement of their total military and political failure. For the English, it was a moment of supreme triumph, the fulfillment of a claim that had been passed down for generations. Historians still argue whether this treaty was a valid legal document or simply a political tool. The French, for the most part, saw it as a violation of French law and custom. They believed that a king could not simply disinherit his son. But with the Burgundians backing Henry IV, and with the French court in such a state of chaos, there was little anyone could do to stop it. The treaty led to the creation of a dual monarchy in 1422, when both Henry V and Charles VI died within months of each other. Henry IV's son, the infant Henry VI, was now technically the King of England and France. But this dual monarchy existed only on paper. The English controlled northern France, with Paris as their administrative capital. But the vast majority of the country, especially the south, remained loyal to the disinherited Dauphin, who now styled himself as Charles VII. The war, far from being over, had simply entered a new, more complicated phase. The English had a legal claim, but the French had a legitimate leader in Charles VII. It was a stalemate, a world with two kings of France, one with the papers and one with the people. And it would take a miracle and a very determined young woman to break the deadlock. With the Treaty of Troyes now a legal, if not universally accepted reality, the English found themselves in an unprecedented position. An English infant, Henry VI, was now the official ruler of both France and England. A dual monarchy had been established, but it was an extremely fragile one. The English, supported by their Burgundian allies, controlled Paris and most of northern France. The French government, such as it was headquartered in the city of Bourges, in the south of the country. This gave rise to a famous and slightly sarcastic nickname for the disinherited Dauphin, Charles VII, the King of Bourges. He was a king with a crown, but no capital, a leader with a claim, but no power. The two Frances, one English-controlled and one French-controlled, existed in a state of Cold War, each vying for legitimacy and control. For the English, the situation seemed promising. They had the legal documents, the support of the powerful Burgundian faction, and a brilliant military leader in the Duke of Bedford, the regent for the infant Henry VI. Their strategy was to slowly but surely expand their control, tightening their grip on the territories loyal to Charles VII. The English and Burgundian forces began a series of sieges, methodically chipping away at French strongholds. The French, for their part, were a mess. Their military was disorganized, their treasury was empty, and their leadership was demoralized. Charles VII was a timid and indecisive man, more concerned with court politics than with military campaigns. He was, by all accounts, a passive player in his own war. The French people, exhausted by decades of conflict and civil war, were losing hope. The English seemed unstoppable, and the French cause seemed all but lost. Historians still argue whether Charles VII was apathetic or simply a realist, but the result was the same. The French were on the defensive, but while the English were winning on the battlefield, they were losing the war of hearts and minds. The dual monarchy, which looked so good on paper, was never truly accepted by the French people. The idea of a foreign king, an English king no less, ruling their country was deeply unpopular. The war, which had started as a dynastic squabble, was slowly but surely transforming into a war of national identity. This was a slow, subtle shift that the English, confident in their military superiority, completely failed to grasp. They saw the French as a conquered people, not as a nation with a growing sense of national pride. The English made a fatal mistake when they began the siege of Orléans in 1428. Orléans was a strategically vital city on the Loire River, a key waterway that separated the English-controlled north from the French-controlled south. Capturing it would have been a decisive blow, a dagger pointed at the heart of Charles VII's territory. The siege was a classic medieval affair, with the English building fortified camps, or bastions, around the city and bombarding its walls. The French defenders, though outnumbered, were holding on. But it was a desperate situation. The city was on the brink of starvation, and the morale of its defenders was at an all-time low. It was at this moment, when all hope seemed lost, that the war was about to be turned on its head. A new player, a figure so unexpected and so powerful that she would change the course of history, was about to enter the scene. A young peasant girl from a small village in eastern France, a girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints, was about to arrive on the scene and do what no French general had been able to do. She was going to give the French people a reason to believe. Her name was Joan of Arc, and she was about to become the single most important figure In the entire Hundred Years' War, the story of the Hundred Years' War is full of powerful kings, brilliant generals, and epic battles. But in the midst of this grand, male-dominated saga, a new character was about to arrive on the scene, one that would completely upend the narrative. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was born around 1412 in a small village in eastern France to a family of peasants. She was a simple, illiterate girl with no military training, no political connections, and no wealth. What she did have, however, was an unshakable faith and a conviction that she was receiving divine guidance. From the age of 13, she claimed to hear the voices of saints, specifically Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, who told her to save France and to see the Dauphin crowned king in Reims. In 1429, at the age of 17, Joan of Arc traveled to Chinon, where the Dauphin, Charles VII, was holding court. Getting an audience with the timid and indecisive Charles was not an easy task, but her conviction and her charisma were powerful. According to legend, Charles, wanting to test her, disguised himself as a courtier and had one of his nobles sit on the throne. But Joan, with her divine guidance, was able to immediately identify the true king, a feat that deeply impressed the skeptical court. She told Charles that she had been sent by God to lift the siege of Orléans and to see him crowned King of France. She spoke with a conviction that no one else could muster. And in a court full of cynical and defeated nobles, her belief was intoxicating. Charles VII and his counselors, in a moment of desperate pragmatism, decided to take a chance on her. She was a symbol, if nothing else, a last-ditch effort to rally the French people. She was given a suit of armor, a banner with the fleur-de-lis, and a small military escort. She didn't lead the army in the way a general does, but she was a powerful figurehead. She inspired the French soldiers with her piety and her unwavering belief in their cause. Her presence on the battlefield was a psychological weapon. She was a physical manifestation of God's will, a symbol of hope in a world that had been plunged into despair. The soldiers, who had been losing for decades, suddenly had a reason to fight again. They weren't just fighting for a weak king. They were fighting for God and for France. Joan's first major mission was to relieve the siege of Orléans. This was a monumental task. Orléans was on the brink of collapse, and the English siege was a well-established and powerful one. But Joan's arrival changed everything. She led several attacks on the English bastions, the fortified camps surrounding the city. With her at their head, the French soldiers fought with a renewed sense of purpose and courage. The English, on the other hand, were completely bewildered by her. They didn't know what to make of her. Was she a witch? A messenger from God? Her presence sowed confusion and fear in the English ranks, and their morale, which had been so high, began to crumble. Within 9 days of her arrival, the siege of Orléans was lifted. It was a stunning, miraculous victory. The English, who had been on the verge of taking the city, were forced to retreat. The psychological impact of this event was massive. For decades, the French had been on the defensive, always losing, always retreating. The lifting of the siege of Orléans proved to them that victory was possible. It was the turning point of the war. a shot of adrenaline that revitalized the French cause and gave them a reason to believe in themselves again. The timid Dauphin was no longer the King of Bourges. He was now a king with a champion who would go on to lead him on the next, most crucial part of her mission, his coronation. The lifting of the siege of Orléans was a monumental victory, but for Joan of Arc, it was only the first step of her divine mission. The second, and perhaps most important, was to see the Dauphin, Charles VII, crowned King of France. The coronation was a hugely symbolic act in the medieval world. It wasn't just a ceremony, it was a physical and spiritual anointing that legitimized a monarch's rule in the eyes of God and his subjects. For Charles, who had been disinherited by the Treaty of Troyes and was mocked as the King of Bourges, a proper coronation was absolutely essential to his claim to the throne. But there was a major problem. The traditional site for French coronations, the magnificent cathedral in Reims, was deep in English-controlled territory and held by a powerful Anglo-Burgundian garrison. Joan's plan was simple, and, to many of the pragmatic French generals, completely insane. March an army from Orléans to Reims, right through the heart of enemy territory. The journey was long and dangerous, and the army was made up of a mix of seasoned soldiers and new recruits who were, until recently, a demoralized rabble. Charles VII himself was hesitant, a timid man who preferred the safety of his court to the danger of a military campaign. But Joan, with her unwavering faith and her charismatic leadership, persuaded him to take the risk. She was a force of nature, a symbol of hope that no one, not even the king, could deny. The march to Reims was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The French army, with Joan at its head, didn't have to fight a single major battle. As they marched, a kind of psychological domino effect took place. English held towns and castles, seeing the approach of a French army that was no longer a joke, and with a powerful divine symbol at its head, began to surrender without fight. The English garrisons, isolated and demoralized by the French resurgence, often just packed up and left. The whole campaign was a perfect example of a mainstream historical fact. Sometimes the greatest battles are won without a single sword being drawn. On July 17th, 1429, a little over 2 months after the siege of Orléans was lifted, Charles VII was crowned King of France in the Reims Cathedral. The ceremony was a moment of profound national and religious significance. The anointing oil, a sacred relic, was used to formally consecrate him as God's chosen ruler. Joan of Arc stood proudly by his side during the ceremony, her banner held high. It was the fulfillment of her prophecy and the ultimate validation of her claims. The Dauphin was no more. He was now Charles VII, King of France, and his legitimacy was now beyond question in the eyes of most French people. The coronation had a massive impact. It completely shattered the fragile foundation of the dual monarchy established by the Treaty of Troyes. Henry VI, the English infant king, now had a legitimate, divinely sanctioned rival. The war, which had been about a dynastic squabble, was now about a legitimate French king fighting to reclaim his kingdom from a foreign invader. The coronation of Charles VII was the beginning of the end for English dreams of ruling France. The tide had turned, and the English, who had been so dominant for so long, were now on the defensive. Joan of Arc, the simple peasant girl, had, in just a few short months, completely changed the course of the Hundred Years' War. But her story, tragically, was far from over. The coronation of Charles VII in Reims was a political and spiritual triumph for the French, but it was also the beginning of the end for Joan of Arc. Her mission, as she understood it, was complete. She had lifted the siege of Orléans and seen the Dauphin crowned king. But Charles VII and his court, now with a newfound sense of confidence, wanted to continue the momentum. They saw Joan not just as a religious symbol, but as a powerful military tool, a lucky charm they couldn't afford to lose. Joan, for her part, wanted to march on Paris and drive the English out once and for all. She believed God willed it, and she believed it was achievable. But Charles and his counselors, more cautious and more pragmatic, were hesitant. They favored diplomacy and negotiation over a direct assault on the heavily fortified capital. Against the advice of the king, Joan led a small attack on Paris. The assault was a complete failure. She was wounded in the attempt, and the French army, demoralized by the defeat, was forced to retreat. This was a devastating blow to her prestige and a huge relief to the English, who had been terrified of her. From this point on, Joan's influence at court began to wane. The nobles, who had always been suspicious of a peasant girl holding such power, began to whisper that her divine inspiration was running out. She was sidelined, her advice was ignored, and she was no longer at the center of the French military strategy. The war, for her, was becoming a frustrating, grinding affair, a stark contrast to the glorious, quick victories of the past. Then, in May of 1430, while leading a small sortie to relieve the town of Compiègne from a Burgundian siege, Joan was captured. It was a tragic and a bit of a chaotic moment. As she was trying to get her soldiers back into the city, the gates were closed behind her, either by accident or, as some historians believe, by a treacherous act of a French commander. She was surrounded and pulled from her horse by a Burgundian soldier. The Burgundians, as allies of the English, were more than happy to have her. She was a valuable prisoner, a bargaining chip of immense political and propaganda value. The English and their Burgundian allies were not going to let this opportunity pass. They saw Joan not as a military commander, but as a heretic and a witch. They believed that her military successes were not the work of God, but of the devil, and they were determined to prove it. The Duke of Bedford, the English regent of France, paid a massive ransom for her capture. She was then put on trial in the city of Rouen, a city in English-controlled Normandy. The trial was a farce, a legal proceeding with a predetermined outcome. It was run by English sympathizers, most notably Bishop Pierre Cochon, a French cleric who had sided with the English. The goal was simple: to discredit her, to prove she was a heretic, and by doing so, to delegitimize Charles VII's coronation, which she had made possible. The trial lasted for months. Joan, a young, illiterate girl, was subjected to a relentless barrage of theological and legal questions from a panel of highly educated clerics. She defended herself with a clarity and a wisdom that astonished her accusers. She never wavered in her belief that her voices were from God, and she refused to deny her mission. But the deck was stacked against her. She was eventually convicted of heresy and witchcraft and sentenced to death. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was just 19 years old. Her death was a tragic and unjust end to a truly remarkable life. But it did not, as the English had hoped, end the French resurgence. In fact, it had the opposite effect. Her martyrdom created a powerful symbol of French resistance, and her memory would go on to inspire the French for centuries to come. The martyrdom of Joan of Arc was a tragedy for the French, but it was a disaster for the English. Instead of discrediting Charles VII, her death had the opposite effect. It turned her into a saintly figure, a national hero, and a powerful symbol of French resistance. The English, in their cold-blooded political maneuvering, had created a legend, and legends are much harder to kill than a teenage girl. The death of Joan didn't end the war. It gave the French a renewed sense of purpose and a rallying cry. Charles VII, who had been a timid and indecisive king, now had the moral high ground. He was a king fighting to avenge his champion and reclaim his kingdom. For the English, the tide of the war was turning against them in a subtle but irreversible way. Their crucial alliance with the Burgundians, which had been the foundation of their success, was beginning to crumble. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, had been a sworn enemy of Charles VII after the assassination of his father. But as the years went on, and the English failed to deliver on their promises, the alliance began to fray. The Burgundians were a powerful force in their own right, and they were beginning to see that their future might be better served by a united France than a fragmented one controlled by a foreign power. The English, for their part, were becoming more isolated. They had a child king in London, and their regent in France, the Duke of Bedford, was struggling to hold their gains together. The breaking point for the Anglo-Burgundian alliance came in 1435 at the Congress of Arras. This was a grand diplomatic meeting, a desperate attempt to forge a lasting peace. The English, the French, and the Burgundians all sent representatives. The English, however, were stubborn. They refused to renounce their claim to the French throne and were unwilling to make any meaningful concessions. This infuriated the Burgundians, who saw the English as unreasonable and intransigent. The Congress fell apart, and a month later, the Burgundians signed a separate peace treaty with Charles VII. This was the Treaty of Arras. In exchange for a few concessions, the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, formally switched his allegiance from the English to the French. This was the single most important political event of the second half of the war. With the Burgundians now on their side, the French were a unified, powerful force. The English, on the other hand, were completely isolated. They had lost their most powerful ally, and their grip on their French territories was now extremely precarious. The loss of the Burgundians was a psychological and strategic blow from which the English would never fully recover. The French, with their newly unified front, were now able to go on the offensive. They began to systematically retake the English-held territories, not through grand battles, but through patient, grinding campaigns of siege and attrition. much like the strategy that Charles V had used decades earlier. The most symbolic and important of these victories came in 1436, when the French recaptured Paris. The city had been the administrative capital of the English dual monarchy, and its loss was a massive blow to English prestige and a huge morale boost for the French. The English garrison in the city was small and demoralized, and the citizens of Paris, who had long been resentful of their foreign overlords, were more than happy to help the French army get in. Charles VII, the timid Dauphin, who had been mocked as the King of Bourges, finally entered his capital in triumph. The war was far from over, but the French had reclaimed their capital, unified their kingdom, and were now on the march to victory. The English, once the masters of France, were now a beleaguered occupying force, and the long, slow process of their expulsion had begun. The French had a new king, a unified kingdom, and a renewed sense of purpose. But the war was far from over. Charles, now safely in Paris, understood that if he was going to expel the English for good, he couldn't rely on the same old, disorganized military structure that had failed his predecessors so spectacularly. He needed to professionalize his army, to move away from the feudal system where nobles raised their own armies for short campaigns and toward a standing royal army that was a permanent, disciplined force. This was a radical idea in the 15th century, but Charles was a king who had learned his lessons the hard way. His military reforms began in the 1440s, during a period of truce with the English. Charles created the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, a standing army of professional soldiers who were paid a regular wage by the crown. These men, unlike the feudal levies of the past, were well trained, well equipped, and loyal to the king, not to a local noble. He also introduced a new system for raising infantry, the Frank archers, free archers. These were commoners who were exempt from taxes in exchange for military service, providing a permanent, reliable source of archers to counter the English longbowmen. This was a massive step toward creating a modern military machine. A historian might call this a classic example of a top-down, state-driven revolution in military affairs. But the most significant and most technologically advanced reform was in the field of artillery. Gunpowder had been around for a while, but it was often used with clumsy, unreliable weapons. Charles VII, with the help of brilliant craftsmen and engineers like Jean Bureau, invested heavily in developing and mass-producing more effective cannons. These new cannons were mobile, powerful, and most importantly, accurate. They were no longer just for bombarding castles. They could be used on the battlefield to devastating effect. The French were now the masters of artillery, a new technological advantage that would completely change the nature of siege warfare. They could now blast holes in walls that had previously been considered impregnable. These reforms were a game changer. By the time the truce ended in 1449, the French army was a completely different beast. It was a professional, well-equipped, and well-led force that was superior to anything the English could field. The English, on the other hand, had become complacent. They were still relying on the same old tactics and the same old longbowmen that had won them so many victories in the past. But against a modern, disciplined French army, with powerful cannons. The old ways were no longer good enough. The tide had turned, and the English were about to find out just how badly. The French began to systematically reclaim the territories they had lost. Normandy, a region that had been under English control for decades, was the first target. The French army, with its new artillery, began to lay siege to English-held towns and castles. The sieges were short and brutal. The French cannons would bombard the walls until they crumbled, and then the French army would storm the breach. The English garrisons, demoralized and isolated, often surrendered without a fight. The French were now winning not with luck, but with superior technology and organization. This was the final phase of the war, a methodical, grinding process of expelling the English from every inch of French soil. With the French army now a professional, well-equipped fighting force, the final act of the Hundred Years' War was a series of grinding campaigns to expel the English from their last remaining strongholds. The French didn't need another Agincourt. They just needed to systematically dismantle the English presence piece by piece. The English, on the other hand, were in a state of political and financial decay. The Duke of Bedford, the able regent of France, had died in 1435, and the English court was plagued by infighting and a weak king, Henry VI, who was not a military man and was, in fact, beginning to show signs of the same mental illness that had plagued his French grandfather. This internal weakness in England, combined with a revitalized French army, was a fatal combination. The French began their campaign in Normandy in 1449. The English had controlled the region for decades, and they thought their hold was secure. But the new French army, with its superior artillery, was a force they were unprepared for. The French launched a series of sieges, and one by one, the English-held towns and castles began to fall. The French artillery, with its ability to smash down walls that had been considered impregnable, was the star of the show. Rouen, the capital of English-controlled Normandy and the place where Joan of Arc had been executed, fell in 1449. It was a hugely symbolic victory, a powerful signal that the English were now on the run. The English, in a desperate attempt to save their holdings in Normandy, sent a small relief force under the command of Sir Thomas Kyriel. The French, led by a brilliant commander named Arthur de Richemont, met them at Formigny in 1450. The Battle of Formigny was a minor engagement compared to Crécy or Agincourt, but it was historically significant for one reason. It was the first time that French artillery played a decisive role in an open field battle. The French cannons were able to decimate the English longbowmen, the very weapon that had won the English so many battles in the past. The English were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and soundly defeated. The victory at Formigny sealed the fate of Normandy. The French systematically recaptured the rest of the province, and by the end of 1450, English rule there was over. With Normandy now back in French hands, Charles VII turned his attention to Gascony, a region in the southwest of France that had been an English possession for over 300 years. The people of Gascony, who had a strong economic relationship with England, were not exactly eager to become French subjects. But the English government, mired in its own internal political squabbles, and running out of money, was unable to send a substantial relief force. The French, with their new army and their powerful artillery, began to lay siege to the major cities of the region. Bordeaux, the capital of Gascony, fell in 1453. It was a massive blow to English prestige and a financial disaster for a country that had been running on the profits of the Gascon wine trade for centuries. But the English made one last desperate attempt to save the region. An English army under the command of John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, a legendary English knight, landed in Gascony in 1453. Talbot was a brilliant commander, but he was also 66 years old, and he was fighting an army that was far more technologically advanced than his own. The two armies met near Castillon, where the French, under the command of Jean Bureau, had built a strong fortified camp with a massive number of cannons. Talbot, in a fit of classic chivalric folly, launched a direct attack on the French camp. The French artillery, in a terrifying display of firepower, decimated the English army. Talbot himself was killed, and the English army was annihilated. The Battle of Castillon was the final major engagement of the 100 Years' War. It was a grim, brutal affair that proved once and for all that the age of the heavily armored knight was truly over. It was a mainstream historical fact that firepower, not bravery, was now the key to victory. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the definitive end of the 100 Years' War's major fighting. The English army was destroyed. Their last great commander, Talbot, was dead, and their final stronghold in Gascony, the city of Bordeaux, surrendered to the French soon after. The English were left with only one possession on the continent, the city of Calais, a symbol of their past victories that would remain in their hands for another century. But for all intents and purposes, the long war was over. There was no grand peace treaty, no official declaration of surrender. The English simply stopped fighting. They were defeated, exhausted, and utterly broke. The war, which had begun over a century before with a claim to a throne, ended with a whimper, not a bang. The long-term effects of the war were profound and completely reshaped the political landscape of both France and England. For France, the outcome was an overwhelming victory. Charles Cherothrine, the timid King of Bourges, was now a national hero, the man who had finally expelled the foreign invaders and unified his kingdom. The war, which had been so destructive, had also been a kind of crucible. It had forged a sense of French national identity, a collective memory of fighting together against a common enemy. The old feudal system, with its powerful, semi-independent nobles, was replaced by a stronger, more centralized monarchy. The king now had a professional standing army, a permanent tax base to pay for it, and the respect of his people. The war had created modern France. For England, the end of the war was a period of profound shock and humiliation. The loss of all their continental territories, especially the rich Duchy of Gascony, was a massive blow to their prestige and their economy. The English government, which had been so focused on France for so long, now had to deal with the consequences of its defeat at home. The return of thousands of unemployed soldiers from France, combined with a weak king and a resentful nobility, created a volatile political environment. The English nobles, many of whom had lost lands and titles in France, were angry. They blamed the king and his court for the defeat, and the country soon descended into its own bloody civil war. The Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses was a long, brutal conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, two rival factions of the English royal family. It was, in many ways, a direct consequence of the Hundred Years' War. The nobles, who had spent decades fighting in France, now had the military experience and the private armies to fight each other for control of the English throne. The war was a brutal affair that would last for 3 decades and see the English crown change hands multiple times. While the English were fighting each other at home, the French were quietly consolidating their power and building a strong, unified nation. The two kingdoms, which had been locked in a bitter struggle for over a century, now went in two completely different directions. The war had not only ended a conflict, it had changed the very trajectory of two nations. So, the Hundred Years' War didn't just end on a battlefield in France. It ended in the political chaos and civil strife of England. The English, who had been so close to winning it all, lost everything, and in their defeat, they turned on themselves. The French, who had been so close to losing it all, unified and emerged as a powerful modern state. It was a stunning reversal of fortune, a final ironic twist in a long, complicated, and utterly brutal story that would forever shape the history of two great nations. The defeat of the English at Castillon and the end of their presence in Gascony didn't just mark the end of the Hundred Years' War. It set in motion a period of profound internal turmoil in England. The English monarchy, which had been so powerful and so focused on its continental ambitions, now had to deal with the consequences of its spectacular failure. The war had been an expensive affair, and the country was left with a massive debt and a deep sense of national humiliation. The king, Henry VI, was a weak and ineffective ruler, and his mental state was a constant source of anxiety. He was known for his piety, but his indecisiveness and his bouts of catatonic insanity made him utterly unfit to rule. This power vacuum at the top created a perfect opportunity for the ambitious and powerful nobles to vie for control. The nobility in England, many of whom had grown rich and powerful fighting in France, had now returned home with their private armies and a taste for combat. The country was divided into two main factions: the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by a white rose. The Lancastrians were the family of the current king, Henry VI, and the Yorkists were led by a powerful and ambitious noble, Richard, Duke of York, who had his own claim to the throne. The two houses began a long, brutal, and confusing civil war that would last for 3 decades and become known as the Wars of the Roses. It was, in many ways, the final, messy conclusion to the Hundred Years' War. The Wars of the Roses was a direct result of the political and military consequences of the French defeat. The nobility, who had been a cohesive unit in France, were now at each other's throats. The soldiers, who had been fighting the French, were now fighting their fellow Englishmen. The war was a brutal affair, full of shifting alliances, double crosses, and violent battles. It was a time of political instability, and the throne changed hands multiple times. At one point, Henry VI was deposed and imprisoned, and the Yorkist leader, Edward IV, became king. Later, Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne before being murdered. It was a period of chaos and bloodshed that tore the country apart. While England was fighting itself, France was quietly and effectively consolidating its power. The French king, Charles VII, was now a powerful, respected monarch. The war had given him the perfect excuse to create a standing army and a permanent tax base, which made him independent of his nobles. He was able to crush the power of the great feudal lords and create a centralized, modern state. The French, no longer distracted by a foreign war, were now able to focus on their own internal development. The contrast between the two countries could not have been more stark. One was descending into chaos and civil war, while the other was rising as a strong, unified nation. It was a classic example of how a military defeat can have a profound impact on a nation's internal politics. The Wars of the Roses would eventually come to an end with the rise of a new dynasty, the Tudors, but the legacy of the Hundred Years' War would linger for centuries. The English, who had once dreamed of a dual monarchy, were now left to their own devices. A small island nation separated from the continent by a channel of water and a century of animosity. The war had changed their national identity, turning them from a continental power to a maritime one. It was a long, painful, and ultimately necessary process of finding a new path for themselves. For France, the war had been a bloody and costly crucible, but it had also been the birthplace of a new, unified, and powerful nation. The end of the Hundred Years' War was not an end, but a beginning, a moment that would forever shape the destiny of two great countries. The final act of the Hundred Years' War left an indelible mark on the national identities of both France and England, and its legacy, like a long shadow, stretches far into the modern era. For France, the war was a crucible that forged a new sense of national unity. Before the war, France was a patchwork of semi-independent duchies and counties, each with its own customs and loyalties. The French nobility often saw themselves as Breton, Burgundian, or Gascon first, and French second. The shared experience of fighting a common English enemy for over a century, however, created a powerful sense of collective identity. Joan of Arc, in particular, became a powerful symbol of this new French nationalism. She was not a noble, but a peasant girl who fought for France, a hero for all French people. The war had transformed France from a feudal kingdom into a modern nation-state, with a centralized government, a professional army, and a king who ruled over a united people. The French national consciousness, as we understand it today, was born on the battlefields of the Hundred Years' War. For England, the outcome was more complex. The loss of all their continental territories, with the exception of Calais, forced the English to look inward and, eventually, outward in a new direction. The English monarchy, which had been so focused on its French ambitions, now had to deal with the political and economic consequences of its defeat at home. The Wars of the Roses, a direct result of the Hundred Years' War, was a bloody and brutal period of civil strife that forced the English to confront their own internal problems. But when the Tudors finally emerged victorious, they created a new, more centralized monarchy that was also, in its own way, a step toward a modern nation-state. Without their French lands to worry about, the English began to focus on their navy and their maritime power. This shift in focus would eventually lead to the British Empire and their dominance of the seas for centuries to come. Historians still argue whether the loss of France was a blessing in disguise for England, forcing them to become the global maritime power we know today. It's a compelling thought, isn't it? That a defeat on land led to an empire on the sea. The war also had a profound impact on the art, culture, and language of both nations. In France, the war contributed to the decline of the feudal system and the rise of the monarchy, which in turn led to a new kind of patronage and a new cultural identity. In England, the war had a more subtle effect. It helped to solidify the use of English as the language of the court and government. Before the war, the English court was still largely French-speaking, a legacy of the Norman conquest. The long conflict with France made it politically unpopular to speak the language of the enemy, and English, the language of the common people, began to take its rightful place in the halls of power. It's a light-hearted, if slightly tragic thought, that a war of a century and more was, in some small way, responsible for why we speak English today. Ultimately, the Hundred Years' War was more than a series of battles and political maneuvers. It was a transformative period that ended one era and began another. It was the end of the medieval world, with its chivalric knights and its feudal loyalties, and the beginning of the modern world, with its powerful nation-states and its professional armies. It was a war that started over a claim to a throne, but it ended with the birth of two nations, each with its own unique identity forged in the crucible of a long, bloody, and defining conflict. The Hundred Years' War, in a way, didn't really end with a definitive peace treaty. It just stopped. The year 1453 is the conventional end date, but no one shook hands and signed a document to formally conclude the conflict. Instead, the English, having lost their final battles and their last strongholds in France, simply ceased to fight. They were exhausted, bankrupt, and preoccupied with their own internal squabbles. The French, for their part, were content to let them go. They had, after over a century of on-again, off-again warfare, achieved their primary objective: the expulsion of the English from French soil. The English only retained one small strategic city, Calais. This port, a symbol of their past glories and a crucial trading hub, would remain a small English island in a now unified France for another century. But it was a consolation prize that did little to make up for the loss of their vast, rich continental territories. The lack of a formal peace treaty is a fascinating historical footnote. It means that, technically, the English monarchs retained their claim to the French throne for centuries to come. They continued to quarter the French royal arms with their own and styled themselves as King of France. This was a purely symbolic act, of course, a bit of historical cosplay that had no real political meaning. It wasn't until 1802, during the Napoleonic Wars, that the English king, George III, finally and officially dropped the claim. It's a bit like a family that keeps a dusty old deed to a house they haven't owned in generations. It's a quaint tradition, but everyone knows who the real owner is. The final defeat had a massive impact on England. The English government, which had spent so much treasure and blood on the war, was now in a state of crisis. The English people, who had been told for so long that they were on the verge of conquering France, were now left with a profound sense of humiliation and a mountain of debt. King Henry VI, a weak and pious man, was unable to provide the strong leadership that the country needed. The powerful nobles, many of whom had lost lands and prestige in France, began to turn on each other. They had spent decades fighting a common enemy in France, but now, with that enemy gone, they began to fight among themselves for power and influence. This period of political chaos and infighting was the direct precursor to the Wars of the Roses, a long and brutal civil war that would consume England for the rest of the 15th century. It was a messy, painful transition for the English. The war with France, for all its brutality, had provided a kind of external focus, a way to unite the country. With that gone, the country's internal divisions and rivalries boiled over into a full-blown civil war. The English, who had been a dominant force in Europe for a time, were now completely preoccupied with their own domestic problems. The end of the Hundred Years' War for them was not a moment of peace, but a moment of transition from one kind of conflict to another. For the French, however, it was a time of consolidation and nation building. The two nations, who had been so intertwined for so long, were now on two completely different paths, a divide that would shape their destinies for centuries to come. The sudden, ignominious end of the English adventure in France left a gaping wound in the heart of the English body politic. After decades of fighting and sacrificing for a cause that was now utterly lost, the English were a nation adrift. The returning soldiers, unemployed and often brutalized by years of war, became a source of instability. The great nobles, who had been united by a common enemy and the promise of French lands, were now turning their formidable private armies and their considerable ambitions on each other. The country was in a state of political and social decay, all brought on by a monumental and very public failure. This was the perfect breeding ground for a civil war, and sure enough, one was about to begin. The conflict that erupted in 1455 would be known as the Wars of the Roses, and it was, in many ways, the Hundred Years' War's final, messy, and very English act. The war was a struggle for the English throne between two branches of the Plantagenet royal family. The House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. At the heart of the conflict was King Henry VI, a gentle, pious man who was, unfortunately, a terrible king. He was indecisive, easily manipulated, and prone to long periods of mental illness, a debilitating condition that seemed to run in his French grandfather's family. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, a formidable and ambitious woman, was a force in her own right, but her foreign birth and her fierce defense of her husband's authority made her unpopular with many of the English nobles. The opposition was led by Richard, Duke of York, a man with a strong claim to the throne and the respect of many of the country's most powerful families. The Wars of the Roses was not a clean, two-sided conflict like a modern political rivalry. It was a complex and confusing period of shifting alliances, betrayals, and brutal battles. Nobles would switch sides seemingly on a whim, and a man who was fighting for the Lancastrians 1 year might be fighting for the Yorkists the next. The constant fighting in France had also trained a generation of English soldiers and commanders for this very moment. They had learned the tactics of warfare, and they had no moral qualms about turning those tactics on their countrymen. A historian might call this a classic example of a nation's military culture, forged by a foreign war, turning inward with devastating results. One of the most defining aspects of the conflict was the role of the great nobles, men like the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who had the power to make and unmake kings through a combination of military force and political maneuvering. The war saw some truly brutal battles. At Towton in 1461, a massive battle was fought in a blinding snowstorm, and it resulted in a devastating defeat for the Lancastrians. It's still considered one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. The country was ripped apart by the conflict, and the throne changed hands multiple times. At one point, Richard of York's son, Edward, became king as Edward IV, but his reign was interrupted by a brief Lancastrian resurgence before he was restored to power. It was a chaotic, violent, and utterly miserable time to be in England. For a brief, shining moment in the 1470s, it seemed as if the war might be over. Edward IV was a strong king, and he managed to restore some semblance of order. He even began to think about resuming the war in France. But this was a fantasy. The English government was too weak, and the country was too divided to ever seriously consider another continental campaign. The Wars of the Roses had completely consumed the English aristocracy and their political will. The defeat in France had, in a sense, made them too busy to fight anyone else. It's a bit like a group of friends who, after a spectacularly bad and expensive trip, come home and start fighting with each other over who should have paid for what, and in the process, forget all about the trip itself. The English had forgotten all about France. The final, lasting impact of the Hundred Years' War was not found on a battlefield, but in the slow, grinding evolution of two nations. For France, the war was a transformative, if brutal, experience. The constant fighting against a foreign enemy had over a century created a profound sense of shared identity and purpose. The war had not only driven the English out, but had also shattered the old feudal power of the great nobles. The king, Charles VII, emerged from the conflict with a centralized government, a professional, standing army paid for by a permanent tax, and the respect of a newly unified people. The war, for all its horrors, had forged modern France, a nation-state with a strong sense of national identity and a powerful monarchy. The French national consciousness, as we understand it today, with its pride and its unique cultural identity, was a direct consequence of this long and bloody struggle. For England, the outcome was more complex. The loss of all their continental territories, save for the port of Calais, was a national humiliation and a financial disaster. The country was thrown into decades of civil war, the Wars of the Roses, as the great nobles, now unemployed and resentful, turned on each other. This internal conflict was a direct consequence of the Hundred Years' War, and it effectively ended any hope of England resuming its continental ambitions. But the loss also forced England to look inward and eventually in a new direction. With their continental dreams shattered, the English began to focus on their navy and their maritime power. This shift in focus would eventually lead to the Great Age of Exploration and the rise of the British Empire. Historians still argue about this, of course, but it's a compelling idea that a defeat on land led to an empire on the sea. The war also had a profound impact on the English language. Before the war, the English court was a French-speaking one, a legacy of the Norman conquest. The long conflict made it politically unpopular to speak the language of the enemy, and English, the language of the common people, finally took its rightful place in the halls of power. It's a bit of an ironic thought that a war fought over the French throne was, in some small way, responsible for why we speak English today. Ultimately, the Hundred Years' War was a massive turning point in European history. It was the end of the medieval world, with its chivalric knights and its feudal loyalties, and the beginning of the modern world, with its powerful nation-states, its professional armies, and its new forms of warfare. The longbow and the armored knight, once the pinnacle of military technology, were made obsolete by the disciplined infantry, and, most importantly, the devastating new power of gunpowder artillery. The war didn't just end a conflict, it ended an era and gave birth to two nations, each with its own unique destiny forged in the crucible of a long, bloody, and defining struggle. The long night is now over, and the story is complete. As you drift off, let the images of kings and knights, of victories and defeats, of two great nations being forged in the fires of a long and terrible war, fade away. The battles are over, the trumpets are silent, and the soldiers are home. Now, let your own world become quiet as the echoes of history settle into a peaceful stillness. The old familiar ache of a long story coming to its conclusion. The final chapters of any great book are always the most important, and this one is now closed. So close your eyes, take a deep, slow breath, and rest.